it's no longer that multinationals respect the laws of every country. It's that the world's most powerful country has become the representative of those multinationals. Our defense becomes dependent on not finding Google. And come on.
Hello and welcome to this special mini-series of Policy Fix What Should Andy Burnham Do? Today we're going to be talking about one of his big ideas, public control, and what it means and how it could be applied in different sectors. With me is Tony Curzon Price, who is a policy fellow at Nesta and an economist, and has had a rich and varied career. He's been a founder of a technology business in Silicon Valley, worked at the Competition and Markets Authority and Number 10, been the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy, and he's here with us to talk about both his past experience in all those sectors, but also what we can do in the new economy as it's emerging. Tony, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here, Ravi.
So I'd like us to go through all the different reasons why you might intervene as the state and the different types of intervention, ranging from nationalisation through to what Burnham did on the buses, where you've got a commissioner-provider split, essentially. Mm-hmm. I want to start perhaps with the most obvious example of why you might want to assert greater public control, which is where we've got natural monopolies like Thames Water or National Grid, and there is a perceived regulatory failure. The regulators just fail to effectively intervene. Perhaps just say a bit more about, do you think those examples are because of individual regulatory failure that could have gone differently, or has there been an inherent problem in the nature of natural monopolies being regulated, that the information asymmetry is always so great that you'll never win the cat and mouse game?
I think it's a very interesting question. And actually, I'd go to the point. I mean, obviously, natural monopoly has always, by all sides in politics, been recognised as being a special case. Right, the most efficient outcome is to have a single provider, but if you have a single provider, they have undue power. What do you do about that power? I think Andy Burnham is right to go back to the 1980s and the great Thatcherite experiment here. And he's right to revisit it. Because, of course, that wasn't saying natural monopoly is fine. It was saying we've got a new way to deal with natural monopoly. Very interestingly, by the way, I remember once writing a speech for a Secretary of State, and so digging around on these issues, digging around the Thatcher archive that's all online. There's a letter in the Thatcher archive between from an exchange between Keith Joseph and Hayek in the late 70s, in which Keith Joseph is saying, this privatization stuff, it's really good, isn't it? This is the kind of stuff we need. And Hayek writes back and he says, look, these are natural monopolies. This is hard stuff. Mm-hmm. You can't, and then and Hayek says, look, do it if you must, but remember that the big issue is labor unions, mm-hmm. right? So I think that what that really points to something important about those privatizations and the way in which we treated utilities. The perception in the 1980s was that they were overstaffed, they were Rolls-Royce assets, they'd been gold-plated everywhere, that the unions were too strong and could hold the country to ransom. And in a sense, privatization and re-regulation was sort of dealing with what it perceived to be a much bigger problem. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, how do we best deal with the natural monopoly problem? Mm-hmm. It was, we've got this great big political economy problem, how are we going to deal with it? Mm-hmm. And I think that, so it's good to firstly put it into that context. And secondly, to think a little bit about, okay, what was the model for public control under the the Thatcher, what one might call the British Chicago experiment? And it's probably good to look at telecoms, which is kind of the success story here. Mm-hmm. Okay, when we today we look at the failure, and Andy Burnham talks about the failure. He points obviously to water, points obviously to the problems we have with the electricity networks, the connection queues, the amount we have to pay in order to compensate the wind producers whose energy we can't get here. Those are the sorts of problems you point to. But actually, telecoms, very little talk about the problem in telecoms, at least in telecoms infrastructure, natural monopoly. That system, why did that work? Now, it basically worked because the technology changed at such a rate that what a consumer could do, so what, a consumer wanting control, they could get control by exercising exit rather than voice. They could say, oh, my broadband's not fast enough, I'm going to switch to someone else. My signal's not working, I can get a better phone deal, I can get a package. That was control. And that really gave control. That kind of switching around in the telecoms case, because of the technology change, led to changes in behaviors throughout the supply chain. So you got, a mast rollout, tech, 3G, 4G, 5G rollout. You got, in lots of places, fiber on fiber competition. These were throughout the value chain. You got companies doing different things because people were exercising control.
And yeah, technology competition and competition between different organizations.
And that's right, exactly. And so in a sense, the British Chicago model worked. We have to concede that, where you could actually get the power of exit rather than the power of voice to work. And then, but what actually happened was that in places like water, electricity, gas, railways, buses, etc., the idea was that the big little child idea of his 1983 report was, where you can't get competition, you get quasi competition, you get a regulator kind of being the competitive force, as it were, until you can get competition to really work. And the truth is that what happened was that that's the system we set up, with regulators being told, do this quasi competition, fulfill that role, as if an organization can fulfill the role of a decentralized competitive market, a centralized organization. So we had that situation, and we set up these very powerful regulators to do that. They never could do the emulation of competition. Competition never arrived, except in telecoms where the technology allowed it. And that means that we now have these very distant, very powerful regulators, and people can justly think, well, look, if I wanted something to be different, how would I, what kind of control do I have? I don't actually have exit control, right? You can switch your supplier in your retailer in energy, but what is the difference? They're doing billing and metering, right? I mean, no one gets excited about billing and metering.
But you're not going to necessarily feel a huge sense of control over a nationalized industry, are you? I mean, you could argue that democratically, you can exercise pressure either through a regulator being strong or a nationalized industry. It feels pretty much of a muchness. What is the case for nationalization over a regulated monopoly?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's take a specific example. Let's take water, which in a sense is the absolute purest case of a natural monopoly. Should we nationalize Thames Water or Southern Water? The question, I go with Dieter Helm's view here, that what we need in water's got an unbelievably complex set of externalities associated with it. Enormous environmental externalities. What you do with water influences what you should do with planning. What you do with planning should influence what you do with water. Drainage is kind of a big thing. What highways do has enormous impact on it. So it's really, I mean, in a sense, infrastructure precisely is, it's what sits underneath. It's what supports the whole of the economy, and therefore it has all these complicated knock-on effects. And so it's very difficult to isolate what happens in water to just water. Now, does that mean that you should nationalize? Now, you can nationalize, and indeed, I'm on the whole quite a fan and very optimistic in terms of all the things Burnham says, of the kind of, Sydney and Beatrice Webb had gas and water socialism, saying, look, municipalism, where you run these infrastructure businesses with very close democratic control, these are really good models for dealing with these a lot of complex externalities. Now, so I like that idea. Of course, there's the literature which evolved in the 1980s, which I think again was a good economics literature, saying, well, wait, is ownership really the important question here? Surely the important question is how you regulate, because whether it's publicly owned or privately owned, these companies have got to deal with complex externalities. Your only choice, your only hope is the power of voice, not the power of exit. And therefore, somehow or other, the important question is regulation much more than ownership. And that means that you can flip it both ways, right? I mean, we all remember the period of John McDonnell saying, "Look at the balance sheet. You can, even if you borrow a lot of money to nationalize these companies, you've got the asset on the other side that's being paid for essentially by the flow of bills. It makes no difference." So on the one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, it's also true that ownership in itself doesn't make much difference. The real question is regulation, and there, the example I love in water is Welsh Water, which, by a kind of quirk of the way in which the privatised water system worked, ended up in the hands of a company limited by guarantee that has no equity, has borrowed, has been relatively well run, and reverts to Welsh customers the surpluses that the cost of capital calculation allows it to make, given it has no equity slice. So the question of ownership is a funny one. Nationalisation can work, but I think one needs to think a lot about what are the controls in either the private or the nationalised case.
So that gets onto the question of what I might call like a system architect. So if you think about big transitions in net zero, there are lots of chicken and egg coordination problems. If you're going to move to an electric economy, you've got to have EVs in place. They've got to have charging infrastructure. You've then got to have enough grid reinforcement or batteries. You've got to think about the whole system coordination. And often I think in many sectors, we don't really have that system architect role. I mean, in buses, that was sort of what bus regulation was about. Yes, you can have lots of competition, but you're not necessarily getting the buses to go at the right time. Interoperability is a problem. Why don't we just plan the network and have a sensible system? So I think there was a missing system architect role in a whole set of sectors, including those sectors relating to industrial strategy, where you've got a set of aspirations, but there's no one really in charge of shifting the system.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And obviously in energy, we now have we have NESO, the National Electricity System Operator, sadly much in the news recently, but that's also very importantly not the system operator but the system architect, and that's an entirely welcome thing. And in the water case, I think that we clearly need to have river basin based architects in the same way. But I'd say I would say a few things about that. I mean, it's tempting as you went through it to say, well, look, transition to net zero has got all of these interdependencies, but the transition to net zero itself sits within an economic context which has, in which it itself has interdependencies. And I think that there are a few things that we need to focus on and work out. One of them is, I think, what we need to call out as a legitimacy constraint. And the legitimacy constraint is this. So, the privatizations of the utilities were never popular. They were, the people liked making a quick buck in the SID campaigns, but they were never popular. No one ever thought, oh, this is the right way to do it. And of course, as the problems have got worse and worse in terms of the actual quality of the infrastructure, and by the way, the endless stories about fat cats, bonuses, salaries, jobs which used to be run by effectively senior civil servants, now being run by people earning 10 times more than senior civil servants and focused entirely on financial engineering rather than engineering, right? The legitimacy constraint is really important. And the real question, for example, in the transition to net zero, is how do we combine the technocratic strategic architect piece together with things like industrial strategy, domestic sourcing, supply chains? These are not strictly energy problems, but somehow or other they're deeply political problems, right? How do we get Hull to be a center for offshore wind development? How do we make sure that what the NESO does is compatible with what we're trying to do with the renewal of our nuclear capabilities, etc.? One of the advantages of the CGB, I'm not a nostalgist for the CGB, and I think in many ways the pre-CGB municipalized system had a lot going for it. But nevertheless, one of the advantages of it was that actually it had very close political relationships between a strong controlling CGB, which of course was a procurer, was an intelligent procurer, didn't vertically integrate the whole chain, and Department of Industry, Treasury, etc. You need that kind of close coordination. And I sometimes worry in the way in which we architect things, a lot of it because of the 1980s revolution, is to try and give very clear, very well-defined responsibilities to particular bodies. And then you find that actually that doesn't give enough, there's not enough given the system. And you end up, because you've set that in legislation, you set yourself up for judicial review and kind of being endlessly bogged down in the courts, because that was the basis on which NESO should have made the decision. Actually, you need some give because there's an industrial strategy point. And then you find that the courts are going to, have to follow the law and stop you from doing it. So yes to strategic architects, but let's make sure that the connection with the politics of all this works.
Well, I think energy is interesting in that we've got the biggest statist takeover of that area over the last 15 years. But you've got lots of state institutions which are quite independent of each other. So NESO exists, but actually it's probably the Department of Transport doing all the EV charging infrastructure. Ofgem is quite separate. You've then created the National Wealth Fund and then GB Energy, and then even the kind of, business support and industrial policy to try and capture the supply chain benefits is also made separately. So it's quite hard, even when you've got the state playing a huge role, to get the coordination right, particularly because all of those institutions are set up with an independent remit and they prize that independence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And by the way, and I should say up front, I'm a non-exec on the Ofgem board. None of this is in any sense Ofgem talking. It's me talking in my personal opinions. But I think that you're absolutely right. You take my current current example here is debt on domestic debt on energy bills, something that Miata, by the way, is very preoccupied by. It's wonderful that she's in that position. Now, it turns out that one of the really big sources of that debt, which is socialized, which we all pay for, kind of poll taxi kind of way, we're all paying for the debt. One of the big issues there is in changes of tenancy, and you have to change tenancy law and regulation, the rental sector, in order to put a responsibility on the landlord to inform the energy supplier, right? That would get rid of a very big chunk of this socialized cost problem. And of course, that means that DESNZ has to get MHCLG involved, that there has to be a bill that goes through. You're completely right that the new public management, in some sense, was a model which wanted these extremely clear lines of responsibility and accountability.
Focused like a laser beam, I think, was the kind of next steps agency remit, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And so we've got, you're completely right, that the architecture is wrong for when you're not running a steady state system. You can take a snapshot view in kind of, 2000 or whenever. When were you in government doing this?
Late 90s, sadly.
Late 90s. You take the snapshot view and say, oh, this is how it needs to work. You've got this responsibility, blah blah blah, and then stuff changes. Your policy direction changes, etc. It no longer works. It's become incredibly clunky. And so we do need to allow for much more discretion, much more voice. And by the way, I think this is where municipalization comes in, which is you cannot put all of the burden of political legitimacy on Westminster.
But I was going to ask you that because a lot of the rhetoric is not just about shifting power from the private sector to the public sector, but shifting things downwards towards combined authorities and a more municipal form of public control. How do you think about that when so much of this is also about lots of coordination that needs to exist at multiple spatial levels, that needs to be part of a national strategy? So on energy in particular, what's the right, how do you apply subsidiarity?
So I was going to bring up the subsidiarity word, which of course is a really important principle and it's guiding light, which is okay. So what is at what level do you capture most of the externalities of this decision? That's the level at which you stop going upwards, right? Now, and this is where I think the pre-1945 example of the power system is really interesting, right? Because the power system's built up as usually as municipal enterprises, town-based, and then already in the mid-1920s, it was recognized that it'd be much more efficient if you had a grid on top of it, and you could then, people could swap resilience. You get much more resilience and efficiency from going one level up. Now, in a sense, we've still got, physically, in terms of assets, we've still got that architecture, which says, well, we have a high voltage grid. That's a national thing. It moves things around the country. And that clearly needs to be planned at a national level. That's the point. That's the level at which it makes sense. Then you think about the distribution grids and the distribution operators. Well, actually, they need to be compatible with what's happened at the national level, but what they do has to be, has to be much more about the local level. And when we come to decarbonisation, to all these coordinated decisions around, you've got to have the EVs, therefore you've got to have the local grids reinforced. You want the heat pumps and you want a flexibility coordinated, etc. across streets, across towns. You want to roll this out so that people don't have their streets dug up 3 times in a row, etc., etc. That's all about a local level of coordination. So I think that, the principle of subsidiarity applies very nicely. Of course, in all of these things, there's a problem about where you're joining the national and the local. And there's also a point about local accountability. And on those things, I think that what we need to reimagine what the various technical authorities, the inspectorates, the regulators are doing. One thing that they're doing is they're running the national systems, or they're overseeing the national systems. Another thing they can be doing is they can be offering their services to the democratically controlling authorities to audit what's happening on the ground at their local level. And so one thing that I really liked in the Andy Haldane's Levelling Up white paper, kind of in the dying days of the Tory administration, one of the things that he wrote in that white paper was you need to. One of the things that's very, very confusing in terms of people's sense of control is who's actually responsible and who's to blame.
Yeah.
And his solution there, which I think is, because it's incredibly tempting for, you complain to your local councillor, why is the school you don't know how this incredibly complicated, messy system works. Why is the school not working? How can I change what's happening at the hospital? How about the parking, etc.? It's incredibly easy for a local councillor or an official who answers a question from a local councillor to say, oh, well, yeah, but the reason we do that is because the department has said that. And then you go and you say, okay, department, why are you doing that? Oh, no, that's the responsibility. There's a kind of ping pong of responsibility which doesn't work. So what you need is bodies that provide audit and accountability. And I think that's something that national regulators would be extremely well placed to do in that join up.
You mentioned before that you need different kinds of solutions for steady state versus moments of transition. And I wanted to bring that back to actually financing, because we're now in a moment where huge amounts of infrastructure investment is needed in water, in energy, in data centers and so on. Now, some of these are sectors where there are quite big externalities, where we care about the pace and nature of the transition. Sometimes we don't. And where we do, is there a case for the state playing a bigger role in actually financing that transition, particularly given the kind of cost of capital difference?
One very often comes to the question, what the hell is that big cost of capital difference actually buying us? It's a lot of money, right? The difference between a gilt yield and the weighted average cost of capital in water is 3-4 percentage points. I mean, that when we're worried about where to find $500 million in order to take VAT off electricity, those are big chunks of money. Those are billions that we're handing over to for private finance. So there's a big question as to what the private finance is doing. I always like to take a sort of a very fundamentals view of this. What's the equity for? What's the risk of bankruptcy actually doing? I mean, in the standard story of the market for corporate control, it's disciplining managers, right? And that's important, right? You absolutely need to keep managers really focused on the task they're doing. I'm not, when I look at the kind of nature of the challenge of running a utility and what chief executives of local authorities or of mayoral combined authorities or of departments, I think, these are similarly complex things. I'm not sure that we actually need to have that CEO being managed by investors who are being paid this differential between gilt yields and the allowed cost of capital. Do we really get our value for money in doing that? I suspect that in many cases we're not getting value for money. But does that mean that the Treasury should just say, okay, public balance sheet is there, it's a free-for-all? I think that we also know that it's incredibly hard to control public spending, and particularly if there's a sense of a balance sheet that you can use, very, very difficult to. We have the same problem as investors have, which is how do you control. Or the Treasury has the same problem as investors have, which is how do you control those who've got a mission and whose natural reaction is going to be to buy? I think there is a very nice kind of middle way here, which is to have the public sector co-investing. So to use Great British Energy or the various investment banks that are now publicly owned, and that can raise funds that are under Treasury control, which actually is always a good thing, it seems to me, in these contexts. Use those bodies to co-invest.
Yeah.
And then that means that you're
on the same terms.
On the same terms, because of course, if GB Energy can raise money essentially at gilt rates and can lend out at the cost of capital, then there's a nice surplus there for that's for the public benefit. And these become important important investors. One of the really important, again, going at it from a fundamentals point of view, in a lot of infrastructure, the risk is the state. Right, the state is the source of the risk, which is, are you going to cancel my project? Are you going to change the terms on it, etc., etc.? It's quite right that the state needs to take on some of that risk.
Yeah, I mean, I often wonder, if you sort of said across the whole energy portfolio, the state is going to co-invest as standard across the whole portfolio, wouldn't that actually help in terms of the private sector, because they are probably more de-risked from political interference if they know the state is in with them and will be subject to the same hit if the state messes them around. So, I mean, yeah. So why would this? I know a lot of companies are used to that kind of arrangement in Europe and other countries. So I don't see why they would be particularly concerned about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent piece. And by the way, thing it made me think of is this, which is it's also in a way the way to deal with those complex externalities, because if your investors, your board has got representatives of people whom are in close conversation about the way in which this works for these wider externalities, like domestic supply chains. Should this network company invest in do some forward purchasing for a factory that's going to make sure that we have the capacity to actually build transformers or whatever it is, right? And when you're in the boardroom discussing that, that there's someone in that boardroom who's having the conversations about the way in which that whole policy of reindustrialization is actually going to be pushed forward, that the planning on it is going to work, that et cetera, that has to be something that's entirely beneficial to the other investors and the other shareholders in the company. So yeah, we have to recognize that that there's a lot of politics involved here, that the state is inevitably an important actor across a wide range of activities, and that the private sector is very good at bringing budgetary constraint and budgetary discipline. So we can get all three of those with the kind of system that you propose. Yeah.
I want to move on to how public control can not just deal with kind of obvious regulatory failures like Thames Water, but actually catalyze innovation and new industries. So if you take the China example again, what they did was not just create a vision for electrification, but they then de-risked investment in those spheres through regulation and mandates and subsidies, and putting in place charging infrastructure ahead of demand. So they created the demand, if you like. And then rather than just picking a winner and saying, look, BYD is our company, they had a brutal technology race and had lots and lots of companies compete for that prize, that market that they had engineered. And I think it's quite an interesting example of a sort of muscular collective action by the state to create a market, but then using competition where it should really be needed to drive innovation. And I think that you could do that in all the areas that we think of as industrial strategy, where you think that for resilience reasons or for net zero reasons, other externality, you're clear about the nature of the transition. And I think we sometimes forget that last bit about the need to actually have the technology race, create a technology race.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. China's obviously been extraordinarily impressive at doing this, and of course, Biden, in a sense, copied that in his weirdly named Inflation Reduction Act. Perhaps not so weirdly, after all. If you increase capacity, anyway, blah blah. But I think that's right. And in a way, of course, the CFDs, which for renewable energy, for offshore
Contracts for
wind,
difference,
everything,
yeah.
contracts for differences, the way in which the state promises to pre-buy energy and says, tell us your project, what you need to be paid, has driven extraordinary amounts of competition, has been very good. So I think that's right, that the state has to become a really good procurer. So it needs to have the vision, it needs to have the strategic planning, and it needs to be really good at procurement. I think that so I think that's completely right. I do that. There's some interesting cases like our SMRs. I really hope that the SMRs program works and is successful. I think that the energy density of nuclear just makes it takes away so many of the problems that we have with decarbonisation. That I hope we get there. What I also hope that we do with the SMR regime, because I think what you said is China didn't pick BYD. It was a brutal competition that picked BYD. I hope that
they just back Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce, exactly, to the hilt, which has been, if you look at the Danny Roderick point about 1960s and 70s industrial strategy in Europe, that has been the problem. And it's very strong contrast first to what Japan did, to what all the Asian tigers did. We need to be tough as a state.
I mean, there's another example from another country, India, where quite sort of strong state action has not been crowding out private activity, but actually been enabling even more competition. And that's the example of digital public infrastructure, which we talked about before. Just because I think this idea of public control at the moment tends to be focused on quite old bits of the economy, like water and energy.
Yeah.
But it is very relevant, I think, to how we think about our digital world.
I think it's enormously relevant, and I think there's a lot. I mean, there are a lot of commonalities. I think, by the way, the sense of a lack of control, of course, it exists in that old world for all the political reasons that we've been through. I think the lack of control in cyberspace is also huge, in that the degree of frustration that people can feel being in cyberspace is enormous, and the inability to change anything, right? Again, it's not that there's not really the power of exit from social media, from search, from now from the AI platforms.
They don't even have crap regulators.
Yeah, no, exactly. They really are. So yes, we need to think really hard about how to do that. And you and I were enormous fans of what India has achieved in its digital stack, and it's done identity. By the way, I'd like to know what you think about the identity, because as I understand it, the identity announcement doesn't relate to actually the most important piece of it, which is a system for producing certified, verified credentials. But
right.
I don't think that is being cancelled, but I'm not sure. I'd love to know your view, which is really important and something really good that we've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, what I don't know is whether, I actually don't know exactly what's happening, but also to what extent could you now get to a digital energy grid without necessarily having the spine of a digital ID.
Digital ID.
So could we get to what they've got through a slightly different route?
I mean, so anyway, I'm sort of, I'm parking at the moment but worries about what we've done, but I suspect it may be okay actually. So identity payment system, the wonderful Beacon protocol for very lightweight digital commerce registries. India has really taken charge of its cyberspace, and has done so with a view to bringing the private sector to creating a space. It's you just as we do in the old economy, we create the space in which people can flourish, and you do the same thing. India's done the same thing online. very impressively. China, in a sense, has done it, but in an enormously statist way. India has done it in a way to liberate the decentralized energies, and it's really wonderful to see. I think we should absolutely go down that route. And by the way, there's a kind of an imperative which now feels like a sovereigntist imperative, which is the alternative to us doing payments through a digital pound, doing a good version of ID in every domain: data, energy data, education data, etc. Making sure that that is available and controlled by the citizens. We absolutely need to do that, because the alternative to doing that is a version of techno-feudalism. It's no longer that the multinationals respect the laws of every country. It's that the world's most powerful country has become the representative of those multinationals. Our defense becomes dependent on not finding Google. And come on.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that it's more important that we establish public control in that sphere of activity rather than necessarily fiddling around with the regulatory environment of our old utilities.
Look,
I think we should do that. I just think this is actually more existential.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree.
The other area where we don't talk about public control, but I think we could do, is in relation to consumers' inability to sometimes understand what is a quality product, or the way in which consumers can sometimes be manipulated, or the whole choice environment that we exist in. So the obvious example that was intervened on many years ago was pensions, where the default was not in the right place. But there are so many areas where, particularly in a service-based economy, it's quite hard to discern the quality of a product. And I just wonder whether the state can play a role in solving that informational challenge or that behavioural issue. And also whether AI also is going to solve that for us, in part through agents on our behalf, shopping for us.
So this is a favorite theme of our ex-colleague David Halpern, and big theme of Behavioral Insights team in the building here. And I think that's absolutely right. I think it actually, by the way, I think it very much links to our previous conversation, because of course, what the financial product you buy, the food that you buy, etc., those are very personal, individual choices where the power of exit, the power of choice, does have that rippling effect throughout the supply chain. But what is available to buy, the choice environment itself, is the thing that is created by a complex set of social collective choices. And I'm very struck. I've just come back from a very nice week's holiday in Sweden, and every time I go somewhere, as I go abroad, I'm just struck by the minutiae of the differences of choice environments. You walk around, and what is it that's shouting at you? What is signposted? How do these things even come about? They're often results of kind of accidental things, history, all the rest of it. But nevertheless, they are very distinctive, and they're enormously determinative in our lives. So yes, I think we absolutely need to go there, and need to recognize that the choice environment is one of the really important collective decisions that we make. AI does have the potential to be, will transform the choice environment. When you express confidence about AI agents working on our behalf, I'm with you. However, there is, on our behalf, is doing a lot of work there.
Well, right. Let me give you an example of a company that we've helped get off the ground called Melia, where you type in your preferences. I want to spend £25 on my shop. This is what I like in terms of food, and it will interview you on your recipes, and then it will try to broker the right package of food and recipes for that week within that budget, and it'll then go through to the Tesco's or Sainsbury's app and get it for you. And it's a good example of, instead of your typical shop being either going around the supermarket and buying the extra pair of sweets that you probably wouldn't have done otherwise because it's sold to you, or it's trying to live up to your own preferences in terms of cost and health. And I think that's you could imagine that in a whole sorts of other areas. You could auction your energy profile and get the best energy package, or there are loads of examples where I think this can make you act in a sort of system one like perspective rather than fast thinking, which often gives you bad decisions.
I'm very excited, enthusiastic in the same way. The question, so what are the conditions for that working? The condition is control over data.
Yeah.
Right. Because at the moment, who's got the data to do the personal profiling to get a really attractive shopping basket for me? It's a combination of Tesco or Sainsbury's or whoever I do my shopping with Amazon, with Google, etc. They can do the personal profiling, and then on whose behalf are they doing the personal profiling in order to provide me with my choice environment? So of course, so that's one route for the agents, which is the agent is the Gemini agent, and it's being paid for by the junk food producer. Or you have Melia, which is, as you say, auctioning this person is about to spend £100 on their weekly shop. Who wants to supply given these constraints? It's a lovely model, but people need to be in control of their behavioral profiles, because it could, in a sense, we got trapped. How did Silicon Valley trap us from the kind of wonderful decentralized dream of the 1990s? It trapped us through transactions costs. The platforms just made it simple. They made collecting the data and then the behavioral profiling something that just happened in the background without you worrying about it. If you have to do your own behavioral profiling, I wish Melia every success. But what they really need is for the consumer data that would make this really powerful to be accessible to them. And then the consumer themselves needs, except for the geekiest, probably like you and me, they need to be able to hand over the decisions on that behavioral profile data to an institution they trust.
Yeah.
And then Melia on top of that can build its app saying, I've got something which where I'm not at an informational disadvantage, where your system one preferences are being respected, and where you're not the product that's being sold to the junk food companies.
Yeah, so it all comes back down to information and data ownership. Otherwise, you're going to have these platforms that extract value and squeeze both consumers and providers, I think. We've covered a lot of ground, I think, on how public control can be actually a bigger idea than perhaps people think about it. It could stretch into industrial policy, into consumer markets, and there are different ways of doing public control, from good regulation to co-ownership to the system architect role, through to how commissioning and data sovereignty can help. What's the final question really is, in the first 100 days, what should a Burnham government do? These are sort of quite technically difficult issues. The Treasury will no doubt try to kill quite a lot of this. What's the way of setting this off on the right foot and avoiding it being killed very quickly?
We agreed earlier, Ravi, that in a sense the old economy stuff is there. It's to some degree we're fixing the broken system, and there's perhaps a lesser degree of urgency, except for the perception of non-legitimacy. So I would look very carefully. I'd be looking very carefully in the first 100 days at things like Thames Water and Southern to say, look, here we need to really assert who's in control. I think there's a terrible public spectacle at the moment of dithering of a powerless state and of these kind of monumental amounts of money being talked about when the quality of the infrastructure and so there's something big to be done in terms of the perception there. But I think that you're right that the existential question is around data, AI, and that degree of control. And I think first 100 days, I would grab that agenda. It'll mean being tough with Trump, and I think it's a good thing. But I would give citizens an API right. And it'd be a fundamental big move, very much in the direction of what Europe is doing with the DMA, which is if something is an endpoint expected for a human, then by law, the human on the other side, the ordinary citizen, has to have the right to have a machine read it on their behalf. API right, I think, would be an enormous thing.
And that would be potent because...
That would be potent because all of a sudden what it allows are the sorts of things that you described with Melia. What it allows is the citizen getting control of their behavioral data in order to shape their the behavioral environment. So I think that I would do that. It's a big thing. It's ambitious. It's pro-European. It requires standing up to Trump. HMT in this, I do think, by the way, that the fiscal situation is dire, and Burnham is right in a sense also to say we need to go back to 1979 as being the modernization which didn't actually deliver. We were meant to be on fiscal sound footing. Actually, it turns out the North Sea oil and then an over-leveraged city is what paid for us. Britain, the history of Britain's failed modernizations goes back a long way. He's right to say we need to accept that was yet another example of failed modernization. So HMT have enormous respect for the problem they face, which is the fiscal situation is bad, and that as Reeves and Starmer are absolutely right to say, but not so good at communicating, look, either you grow or the choices are really unpleasant. But I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about are non-fiscal choices.
Yes.
Right? These are about how we do things, how we control things, not about the extra money that we spend. And I think, therefore, that we should be able to, should be possible for Andy Burnham to convince his new chancellor that this works.
Tony, thank you very much. I think we'll have to do an even longer podcast on the failed modernisation of Britain.
Oh, yes, please.
Thank you very much.
Hey, great. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please do like, share and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We've got more coming. For those of you who don't know us, Nesta is a research and innovation foundation based in the UK. We design, test and scale solutions to the big challenges of our time. We're funded by a charity endowment and are politically neutral. For more, do visit www.nesta.org.uk.